If you opened a 1985 casserole and bit into a slightly sweet, herbed, golden brown crouton, that was no accident. It was a marketing triumph masquerading as grandmother's recipe. Somewhere between the cream of mushroom soup and the shredded cheddar, nestled under the foil that had been crimped around the Pyrex by a woman who thought she was simply using what she had in the cupboard, there was a bag, a familiar blue and gold bag, Pepperidge Farm herb-seasoned stuffing mix. And inside that bag were the small, toasted, butter-adjacent bread cubes that had, somehow, silently, without anyone ever quite deciding it should happen, become the universal binder and topping of the American dinner table during the Reagan administration. They showed up in chicken divan. They showed up in broccoli bakes. They showed up in tuna noodle variations that had wandered so far from their 1950s origin they could no longer find their way home. They crowned the top of a Pyrex dish with a golden crunch that suggested effort, tradition, and a certain kind of feminine competence. They suggested that the woman of the house had, at some point, thought about stuffing, had considered seasoning. None of that was necessarily true. But the bag in the pantry suggested it was. And that is the entire story of American casserole cookery in the decade when Madonna released Like a Virgin and everybody started wearing shoulder pads. So here's the question we need to sit with today. How did a product launched in 1956 as a Thanksgiving convenience for one single autumn meal become, 30 years later, the default ingredient in hundreds of weeknight suppers? How did herb-seasoned stuffing mix escape from the turkey and colonize the chicken, the broccoli, the ground beef, the cream of anything? Because this wasn't an accident. It wasn't even organic culinary evolution. It was, as we're about to discover, one of the most successful long-arc marketing campaigns in American food history. And the trail begins, as so many of these trails do, with a determined woman, a sick child, and a kitchen in Connecticut. Her name was Margaret Rudkin. And before we get to 1956, we have to go back to 1937, to Fairfield, Connecticut, to a house called Pepperidge Farm, named for the pepperidge tree that stood on the property, a black tupelo with dark leaves and a proud silhouette. Margaret Rudkin was the wife of a New York stockbroker, mother of 3 boys, and her youngest son had severe asthma and food allergies. The doctor told her, in that crisp, certain way doctors talked in the 1930s, that the commercial white bread the family was eating contained preservatives that were likely making the boy sicker. He told her, almost as a joke, that she ought to bake her own bread. Use stone-ground whole wheat, no preservatives, real butter, real honey. She took him literally. She had never baked bread in her life. Her first loaf, as she later confessed, came out like a brick. But she tried again. And by the 4th or 5th loaf, she had something hearty, slightly sweet from the honey, something that smelled when it came out of the oven, like a farmhouse in a children's book. Her son's asthma improved. The doctor asked if he could buy some for other patients, and Margaret Rudkin, who had no business plan, suddenly found herself taking orders. By 1940, she had converted the garage into a bakery. By 1947, Pepperidge Farm was a real company, shipping whole-grain bread across Connecticut and into New York, with a name that evoked something rustic and Yankee and true. The product was expensive. The loaves were smaller than the industrial white bread they competed with. But Margaret Rudkin had stumbled onto something that American consumers were, even in the 1940s, beginning to crave: authenticity, the suggestion of the homemade, the idea that someone, somewhere, had cared about this bread the way your grandmother might have cared about it. Nobody would have used the word branding back then. But that is exactly what she had built. Let me pause here for a moment, because the smell matters. If you have ever opened a casserole halfway through its bake, peeled back the aluminum foil, and had that first cloud of herbed butter aroma hit you in the face, you know what I'm describing. Rosemary, sage, thyme, a whisper of celery seed, butter melting into cream of mushroom soup, chicken beginning to brown at the edges where the topping has crisped. That smell is not a folk tradition. That smell is a product formulation. Margaret Rudkin's company had spent years perfecting it, and it was about to be weaponized. In 1956, 9 years after Pepperidge Farm went national, the company launched herb-seasoned stuffing mix. The timing was strategic. Post-war America was deep into the convenience food revolution. Swanson had launched the TV dinner in 1954. Betty Crocker cake mixes were dominating the baking aisle. American women, increasingly working outside the home, or at least being told they shouldn't have to slave in the kitchen, were hungry for products that would let them perform tradition without actually doing the traditional labor. And stuffing was the perfect candidate. Nobody wanted to cube day-old bread. Nobody wanted to dry it out in a low oven. Nobody wanted to buy fresh sage and rosemary and celery and chop them and measure them. What they wanted was a bag they could open in November, mix with butter and broth, and stuff into a turkey. Pepperidge Farm gave it to them. The mix was brilliant in its construction. The bread cubes were slightly larger than breadcrumbs, still bread-like, in texture, toasted to a golden brown, and seasoned with a herb blend so distinctive that once you smelled it, you knew it. It was, in effect, an evolutionary descendant of the breadcrumb. But where breadcrumbs were a humble utility, an afterthought made from stale bread, Pepperidge Farm stuffing was aspirational. It was bread cubes with a French name energy, even though it was made in Connecticut. It was the breadcrumb dressed up for dinner. Now here's where the story turns. Because in 1961, Pepperidge Farm was acquired by the Campbell Soup Company. Stop and think about that for a second. Campbell's, the red and white can, the kitchen cabinet colossus. The company that, by the early 1960s, had already established itself as the silent architect of the American casserole through a single product, cream of mushroom soup. That condensed, beige, vaguely mushroomed sauce starter that Dorcas Riley, working in the Camden, New Jersey test kitchen, had in 1955 combined with canned green beans and French fried onions to create the green bean casserole. A dish so iconic that by 1985, an estimated 40% of all Campbell's cream of mushroom soup sold in America was being used to make it. Dorcas Riley had, with one recipe card, founded an entire school of American cookery. The cream of something school. The school that said, take a protein, take a vegetable, dump a can of condensed soup on it, top it with something crunchy, bake at 350 for 45 minutes. And now, Campbell's owned Pepperidge Farm too. Do you see what's about to happen? Do you see the vertical integration of the American weeknight dinner? The company that made the sauce base also, as of 1961, made the topping. The company that had invented the casserole template now owned the finishing element. And for the next 20 years, Campbell's would quietly, patiently, methodically use its recipe card operation, its magazine advertising, its cookbook partnerships, and the back labels of its own soup cans to teach American women that the correct way to finish a casserole was with a layer of Pepperidge Farm herb-seasoned stuffing mix and a drizzle of melted butter. Take a breath here. Let that sink in. The suburban housewife of 1975, paging through Good Housekeeping, reading a recipe for chicken divan that called for a can of Campbell's cream of chicken, a can of Campbell's cream of mushroom, and a topping of Pepperidge Farm stuffing crumbs, had no idea she was reading, essentially, a single corporate advertisement. It looked like a recipe. It walked like a recipe. It had been submitted, supposedly, by a woman named Betty from Des Moines. But the ingredients were a shopping list, and the shopping list had one owner. By the 1970s, the campaign was in full flower. Campbell's and Pepperidge Farm produced thousands of cross-promotional recipe cards that were distributed at grocery stores, tucked into Sunday circulars, printed in magazines, and eventually compiled into spiral-bound community cookbooks by church groups and junior leagues who had no idea they were functioning as unpaid distributors of a marketing campaign. The cards had names that felt like heirlooms: Swiss chicken casserole, broccoli rice supreme, chicken, and wild rice bake. Every one of them, every last one, called for at least two of the following ingredients: a can of condensed cream of something, a cup of sour cream or mayonnaise, shredded cheddar, and a topping of crushed Pepperidge Farm stuffing mix mixed with melted butter. And here is where the psychology gets really interesting. Because what Campbell's had discovered, what their marketing research had surfaced, was that American home cooks in the 1970s and 80s felt a deep, almost inarticulate anxiety about the gap between how their grandmothers had cooked and how they themselves cooked. Grandmother had made stuffing from scratch, tearing day-old bread, drying it on a sheet pan, chopping herbs from the garden. She, the modern housewife, was dumping a bag, and she felt, on some level, vaguely guilty about it. So Campbell's gave her permission. They said, through their recipe cards and their magazine spreads, "It's not just for Thanksgiving. You can use this for everything. Your Tuesday night chicken casserole deserves the same reverence as your November feast. The herbed bread cubes that crown your holiday table can crown your weeknight dinner too." And because the product had already been culturally coded as traditional, as Thanksgiving appropriate, as grandmotherly, using it on a Tuesday borrowed all of that emotional weight. It took the humble chicken and broccoli and elevated it into something that felt like heritage. This is what I want you to understand. This was a marketing triumph. Not because Pepperidge Farm invented a new flavor. They did not. The herb blend was unremarkable. Not because the product was cheaper than making breadcrumbs. It was not. A bag of stuffing mix cost significantly more than a loaf of day-old white bread. The triumph was entirely psychological. They had convinced American women that opening a bag was a form of tradition. Let me give you the signature dish, the one that, more than any other, captures the 1980s Pepperidge Farm casserole moment: poppy seed chicken. If you were alive in 1985 and attended any church potluck in the American South, you ate this dish. If you were a new mother and a well-meaning neighbor brought over a casserole to welcome the baby, it was probably this one. If you opened your freezer in 1987 and found a foil-wrapped Pyrex with a note, odds were strong it was poppy seed chicken. The recipe was almost laughably simple. Take cooked, shredded chicken breast. Mix it with a can of Campbell's cream of chicken soup, sometimes substituted, or combined with Lipton's golden mushroom soup for a richer, browner note. Add a cup of sour cream, a sprinkle of poppy seeds. Spread it in a 9x13 Pyrex. Top with crushed Pepperidge Farm herb-seasoned stuffing mix that had been tossed with a stick of melted butter. Bake at 350 until bubbling and brown. That was it. 5 ingredients, if you counted the chicken. And by the mid-1980s, this Recipe had gone completely viral through the pre-internet viral mechanism of church cookbooks, recipe exchanges, and handwritten index cards passed between friends. Pause again for the sensory detail, because this is the part people remember. The top of a poppy seed chicken casserole, as it emerged from the oven, had what I would call a crunch to softness gradient. The very top layer of stuffing cubes had dried further and browned deeply, almost toasting in the butter that had pooled and crisped. Beneath that, a middle layer had absorbed some of the bubbling sauce and was turning from crouton into something closer to bread pudding. And at the bottom, where the stuffing met the sour cream and soup chicken layer, the cubes had dissolved entirely, acting as a thickener, a binder, melting into the gravy. One bite took you across 3 textures. It was, in its way, genuinely clever engineering. Margaret Rudkin's bread, formulated 70 years earlier for a sick little boy in Connecticut, had become the structural spine of an entire casserole architecture. The Southern Living Casserole School took the Pepperidge Farm topping and made it a regional identity. Throughout the 1980s, Southern Living magazine was perhaps the single most influential cookery publication in the American South, and its monthly casserole features drove grocery sales in ways that retailers could literally track on the shelf. When Southern Living ran a cover recipe calling for a bag of herb-seasoned stuffing, grocers in Birmingham and Atlanta and Jackson and Nashville would watch the stuffing section empty within 72 hours. The magazine's editorial staff were not, to be clear, on anyone's payroll. They genuinely believed they were publishing reader-submitted recipes that represented the best of Southern home cooking. And, in a sense, they were. But the reader-submitted recipes had, over the course of 2 decades, been shaped by the same Campbell's recipe cards those readers had been collecting since they were brides. It was marketing as inheritance. The recipes were real. The cooks were real. The love and effort and hospitality were real. But the ingredient list had been written, invisibly, by a company in Camden, New Jersey. Now I want to take a detour, because the Pepperidge Farm story is not the only story of a strange 1980s casserole ingredient. And to understand why the stuffing mix won so completely, you need to know who it was competing with. Pull up a chair. First contender: ranch dressing packet powder. Hidden Valley Ranch had been launched in 1954 by Steve Henson, a plumbing contractor who had spent years working in the Alaskan bush and returned to California with a salad dressing recipe he'd perfected for his crew. He and his wife bought a dude ranch in Santa Barbara County called Hidden Valley, served the dressing to guests, and began mailing packets of the dry seasoning to customers. By 1972, they had sold the brand to Clorox for $8 million. And by the 1980s, ranch packet powder was everywhere, dumped into sour cream for chip dip, sprinkled on roast chicken, mixed into meatloaf, and yes, added to casseroles, where it provided a tangy, dehydrated buttermilk depth that felt, somehow, like flavor. But it never colonized the casserole the way Pepperidge Farm did. Because ranch was a flavor. Pepperidge Farm was a structure. Ranch could be left out. Pepperidge Farm was the ceiling holding up the roof. Second contender: canned French-fried onions. These crispy, deep-fried, shelf-stable onion shreds had been, as we mentioned, the crown of Dorcas Riley's 1955 green bean casserole. By the 1980s, they were appearing on top of green bean bakes, tuna casseroles, chicken, and rice dishes. But the French-fried onion was a single-dish champion. It owned Thanksgiving green beans. It did not own the weeknight casserole. Third contender: Ritz crackers. Nabisco's buttery, slightly sweet round cracker had been cross-promoted since the 1940s as a topping for casseroles, crushed and mixed with butter. Ritz had a genuine run in 1960s and 70s casserole toppings, and Ritz cracker chicken, a dish where breasts were dipped in butter and rolled in crushed Ritz, was a late 70s staple. But Ritz was sweet. It was a cracker. It never carried the Thanksgiving emotional weight. By 1985, Ritz had lost the topping war to Pepperidge Farm. Fourth contender, plain breadcrumbs. The original, the ancestor, the humble utility. But by the 1980s, plain breadcrumbs had been culturally relegated to breading veal cutlets and meatballs. A casserole topped with plain breadcrumbs looked, in 1985, slightly sad. Pepperidge Farm had so completely repositioned the breadcrumb, had so thoroughly elevated it into the herb-seasoned, golden-cubed, Thanksgiving-coated version that the original could no longer hold its own in the topping category. So here's the reveal. Here's what I've been circling around. The strange ingredient in every 1980s casserole recipe, the one that had no culinary reason to be there, the one that somehow migrated from November 24th to every other day of the year, was Pepperidge Farm herb-seasoned stuffing mix. And the reason it was there was not because it tasted uniquely good, though it did taste pleasant. It was not because it was cheap, because it was not. It was not because it was nutritionally superior, because, dear heavens, no. It was there because in 1961, Campbell's bought Pepperidge Farm, and for the next 30 years, the combined company ran the most successful, least visible, most beautifully patient marketing campaign in American domestic history. The campaign worked because it never looked like a campaign. It looked like recipes. It looked like tradition. It looked like your neighbor's church cookbook. And every single time an American woman opened a bag of herb-seasoned stuffing in April and crushed it over a chicken and broccoli bake, she was, without knowing it, completing a transaction that had been set in motion 30 years before she was born, by a black tupelo tree in Connecticut and a woman trying to heal her son. Let me hold you there for a moment. Margaret Rudkin was not a cynic. She was a mother. She baked bread because her baby was sick, and the bread might help. She sold to Campbell's in 1961 because she was 64 and wanted to retire. She died in 1967 and never saw the 1980s. She had no idea that the stuffing mix she had approved for launch in 1956 would, a generation later, become the bread cube ceiling of the American weeknight. She would have been, I suspect, genuinely delighted, and maybe a little bewildered. The crunch-to-softness gradient on the top of a 1985 poppy seed chicken was her legacy. The herbed butter aroma rising from under the foil of a 1987 broccoli rice casserole was her inheritance passed on. At every church potluck in Montgomery, Alabama, in the autumn of 1989, where a woman brought a Pyrex covered in foil and set it on the fellowship hall table, there was Margaret Rudkin, present through her product. So, what is the legacy? Why does this matter in 2026, 40 years after the 1980s peaked? Because the Pepperidge Farm crouton is still here. Open any modern cookbook, browse any recipe blog, look at the cover of a 2025 issue of any food magazine that still exists. When a contemporary recipe calls for a panko crust, a herbed bread topping, a crunchy finish on a gratin, a crumble on a mac and cheese, a golden brown garnish on a winter squash bake, the flavor template those dishes are echoing was not invented by a cookbook author. It was invented by Margaret Rudkin in 1956 and perfected by Campbell's marketing department in 1978. The herbed, buttered, toasted bread cube on top of a savory bake is, in American food culture, a permanent fixture. It lives on in every artisanal breadcrumb topping at every fancy restaurant. It lives on in the sourdough panko on your Whole Foods sheet pan chicken. It lives on in the hand-torn brioche crumb on the crab gratin at the seafood place downtown. All of them are grandchildren of Pepperidge Farm herb-seasoned stuffing mix. All of them are reaching through different ingredients and at different price points for the same emotional register the stuffing mix established. The register that says, "This dish has been finished. This dish has been topped. This dish has tradition." Marketing as inheritance. That's the phrase I keep coming back to. Because when a campaign works for 30 years, when a product is repositioned from holiday side dish to year-round default, when the back of the bag begins to write the back of the family cookbook, the campaign stops being marketing and becomes culture. It becomes memory. It becomes, for an entire generation, the smell of a specific kind of love. Your mother's chicken divan, if she made it in 1985, was topped with Pepperidge Farm. Your grandmother's church cookbook, if she compiled one in 1987, has at least one recipe that specifies, by name, that very product. Your memory of foil being peeled back over a bubbling Pyrex, of herbed butter steam hitting your face, of the crunch of the top layer and the giving softness of the bottom layer, of the way the sour cream and soup and chicken bound themselves together under a roof of golden cubes. That memory is not just yours. It belongs to millions of Americans, which does not make it less real. The love was real. The hospitality was real. The care that went into it was real. The fact that the ingredient list had been ghost-written by a New Jersey conglomerate does not erase the reality of the woman who assembled it and the family who ate it. It just means that when we talk about food history, we have to talk about the invisible hands, the copywriters, the test kitchen directors, the marketing executives who decided in 1974 that Pepperidge Farm herb-seasoned stuffing mix needed a year-round identity, the recipe card designers, the cookbook editors, Dorcas Riley writing Green Bean Casserole in Camden, Steve Henson mixing buttermilk and herbs in Santa Barbara, Margaret Rudkin kneading whole wheat in Fairfield. All of them, together, wrote the way America ate in the 1980s, and the rest of us, in our kitchens, thought we were just making dinner. So next time you see a recipe that calls for a herbed breadcrumb topping or a panko crust, remember what you're looking at. You are looking at the descendant of a 1956 product that was launched for one holiday and conquered every other day of the year. You are looking at marketing, metabolized over 3 generations, into something that now feels like memory. That is the strange ingredient in every 1980s casserole recipe. Not the stuffing itself, though the stuffing was there. The strange ingredient was the decades of invisible persuasion that put it there. The strange ingredient was the fact that none of us, not our mothers, not our grandmothers, ever chose it. It chose us, quietly, patiently, through the back of a soup can and the pages of a women's magazine, through a church cookbook compiled by a junior league that didn't know it was part of a campaign, through a signature dish called poppy seed chicken that was, when you boiled it down, a 5-ingredient advertisement disguised as Southern tradition. And if that sounds cynical, I don't mean it to. Because the marketing became real, the advertisement became dinner. The dinner became memory. And the memory, golden brown and herbed and steaming under foil, is the inheritance most of us carry forward whether we cook from it or not. The Pepperidge Farm crouton lives on in every modern breadcrumb topping you encounter. It lives on in the panko, the sourdough crumb, the hand-torn focaccia, the buttered Ritz, the crushed cornflake, the seasoned almond meal. Every one of them is reaching toward the same feeling, the feeling of a finished dish, the feeling of a meal that has been topped, the feeling that somebody cared enough to crown the thing before it went in the oven. That feeling has a birthday, it has an address, it has a founder, and it has, most astonishingly of all, a parent company. The next time you bite through a golden crust into something soft and savory and comforting, you're biting through history. You're biting through a garage bakery in Fairfield in 1940, a boardroom in Camden in 1961, a recipe card designed in 1975, and a Pyrex casserole carried across a church parking lot in 1989. You're biting through marketing that was so patient, so thoroughly absorbed into the American palate, that it no longer feels like marketing at all. It feels like grandmother. It feels like home. It feels like the herbed butter aroma rising under the foil of every casserole your mother ever made. And that, more than any recipe, is the real legacy of the strange ingredient in every 1980s casserole. Not what it was, but how completely and how invisibly it became ours.